Hi, Evan from SDMB here. Today we're going to talk about how to prune and brush correctly. Here in the Sonoran Desert, after the monsoons, the trails get really overgrown and they typically need yearly or every other year brushing to make sure that they stay open. A couple things to keep in mind before you start brushing. Number one, make sure you have permission to work on the trails. We're here at Sweetwater Preserve on Pima County land and we have permission from them to do work here, but check in with your local land manager or your local advocacy group if you need to know if you do have permission to work there. Next thing to keep in mind is safety. Safety is very important. Make sure you're wearing work gloves. We recommend actual leather or durable work gloves. Don't use your fancy mountain bike gloves because you're probably going to destroy them and get them full of cactus. In general, you want to try to make sure you're wearing long pants, closed-toed shoes, sunblock if you need it. Just be safe in the desert. Basic tools you're going to need. The simplest form, you just have clippers and a folding saw. With these you can do most of the pruning that you need to do, everything from cactus to shrubs, small trees, etc. If you have a bigger pack or you're hiking in, you can get a lot more done with a pair of loppers and a proper saw. I'm a big fan of a 10-inch pruning saw. This will go through pretty much anything you're going to run into short of a ponderosa pine. But with that, we're going to get into how to trim. Okay, now we're going to talk about how to prune trees and shrubs. So as a general rule, when you're brushing, you want to trim the corridor or the trail out to about 6 feet wide, or roughly an arm span, and up to 10 feet high. And the reason for that is that this is all multi-use trail. We're not just pruning for us, we're pruning for hikers and equestrian users, and obviously if someone's on horseback they're going to be pretty high up as well. So 6 feet wide, 10 feet high. You also want to think in terms of brush it out so you don't have to come back in 6 months and do the same thing. The two main things that we're brushing are cacti and shrubs. And so we'll talk about shrubs and trees first. We got a rider coming up, so in a minute I'm going to have to step off the trail. But what you don't want to see is what we call a coat rack. So this is a poorly trimmed branch called a coat rack. Somebody cut it in the middle there, and this is bad for a couple of reasons. First off, it doesn't look good. Second off, it can be dangerous because someone can snag on it and impale themselves on it. And third off, it's not good for the tree. When you're trimming branches, number one, you want to trim it back to the next major joint, and number two, you want to trim it close to the trunk and at a 90-degree angle. So if you see, I cut it back to, sometimes you call that the collar, this piece around here, and I cut it at a 90-degree angle right up against the trunk. And now looking at some of these upper ones, these aren't necessarily a problem now, but they will grow out of the trail and become problematic for both riders and horses. So I'm going to trim a couple of these back. First off, I'm going to take it all the way back to the next major limb, and I'm going to cut it off at a 90-degree angle. So take these guys off. Pull them out, and I'm creating a brush pile over here, and I'm going to disperse that afterwards. That's the other really important part about brushing, is you want to make it look like you were never here. So therefore, I'm going to take all this stuff, I'm going to drag it off into the desert, and I'm going to make sure that you can't see it from the trail. So next we're going to talk about how to use a saw properly. Typically with a saw you want to do 2 cuts, because if I just cut from the top, it's going to peel down and potentially damage the trunk and hurt the tree. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to undercut, go part way up, again close to the collar, cutting at 90 degrees, and then when I come at it from the top, I'm going to hold on to it, and it's going to come right off cleanly. Like we said, brushing is really important, so I have a brush pile here. I'm going to disperse it. So you can grab it, you can drag the whole thing, you can grab it in pieces. You want to try to avoid just dumping it in the wash, but you can use the wash to walk off and spread it through the desert. So when trimming back cactus like this cholla here, it's pretty much the same principle as when you're trimming a tree or a shrub. So I'm not just going to cut this off in the middle because it doesn't look good and it's bad for the cactus. So I'm going to bring this all the way back. This cholla doesn't really need to be trimmed back quite yet, but eventually it will start growing out into the turn. So, we'll do a little bit of trimming here. So again, I'm going to take it back to the next major trunk. And obviously with cholla, I can't grab it when I disperse it. So I'm going to use my loppers to carry it off. And again, try to disperse it. So more cholla here to trim. Again, this one doesn't necessarily need to be trimmed, but just as a way to illustrate the point. And this is a jumping cholla, by the way. These are one of our really notorious Sonoran species. They're pretty vicious, but I'm going to trim it all the way back to the main stem. I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to grab it with my loppers, and I'm going to carry it off and disperse it out of sight.